So I hope that you will reflect back to what is going to happen to your career and what's going to bring to startup in the innovation ecosystem. So he is also a deputy minister of mining and heavy industry. So that's a new role that he's taken on. And then you also worked for Bank of Merrill Lynch, Bank of America Merrill Lynch for several years. So that's in a nutshell about yourself. So please introduce yourself and tell us your passion in innovation and ecosystem and startup ecosystem.
Sure. Okay. First of all, thank you so much for your invitation. It's great to be here with you. And I think when we talk about innovation, and it's probably one of the most overly used buzzwords, at least when I was back in business school. Leadership, innovation. I think those are the two words that's used, I don't know, 100 times a day during lecture or during conversation with your friends. And so today, I mean, there are a lot of startups, and especially among young people, getting involved in startups and dreaming about the next billion-dollar unicorn business, and that has become sort of the cool thing to do, right? And I think, but when we talk about innovation and the startups, and it's just not a phenomenon in the last 20 years or so. I think, I want, especially the young people, to understand what's really innovation, right? Starting from the technical definition and to how innovation has changed the world as we see it in the last, say, 150 years. And obviously, when we talk about innovation and basically everything great about, we always quote the great examples of the United States. And when we talk about innovation ecosystems, we always talk about Silicon Valley. Why is that? Why, America is where it is today? And what really changed the United States of America? And how Silicon Valley was created? And it really everything boils down to innovation and innovative culture. And so that's why I think when we talk about innovation, I want young people to understand how it has changed the face of the earth, or just the technological advancement we have experienced, but just even overall, just the history of humankind. And if you look at the growth of population or growth of wealth and everything, it's just exponentially, it has been sort of exponential. And it's really it's the innovative culture that sort of let this happen. So let's go, back to even 1900, right? So that means what, 120 years ago, and how the world was, right? And so let me give some examples of, actually, I think I'm jumping maybe a bit too much, but starting from, again, innovation, right? So I think there are very different definitions of innovations,
right?
And then within that, and my favorite definition, or the simplest definition, is innovation is really a change in the process of making products or services and making it accessible to wider population. And that's innovation. So, for example, if you're working on, say, on a spreadsheet, right, doing some work, and then let's say you're putting together a report takes an hour, and then you figure out to get the job done within 30 minutes, right? Because you happen to learn maybe some shortcuts or actually better way of doing that same work, with for a shorter period of time and with lesser resources. That's innovation. So that means, in that respect, everybody can be innovators. In fact, I think we are actually all innovators to some extent. And so that's why when we talk about innovation, we shouldn't be just putting or sticking innovation to just high-tech big companies. So for example, I think a lot of people understand innovation only applicable or belongs to, let's say, Apple, because they produce this iPhone, right? It's a leader in its sector. It's eye-opening. It's super innovative, but innovation actually matters and very important, not just for the developed world, especially those who are, trying to thrive in emerging markets like Mongolia.
Mm-hmm.
So in terms of innovation and its transformative power, actually, Mongolia, so emerging markets like Mongolia or China, or the likes of many other countries, actually, this is more important. So within innovation, there can be different types, right? So for example, sustaining innovation, efficiency innovation, and then my favorite is really market creating innovation.
Right.
So this is according to Clay Christensen, who used to be a professor of mine at Harvard Business School, and who is really the godfather of disruption theory. So when we actually, especially among startups, right? So what everyone is really trying to achieve is actually to disrupt the existing market, right? So that you can actually create a better product and take over the existing monopoly or oligopolies. So Clay Christensen basically defines innovation by 3 types, and then efficiency, right? Sustaining. So what those are is basically, for example, let's say Lipton tea, right? Lipton tea is probably one of the most widely sold tea brands around the world. Maybe, I don't know, market share, 40% of market share, right? And then because they are such, they own such a big portion of the market, right? And they have to keep that market share. And then what they do is, they come up with different types of different flavors, adding into the family of different types of Lipton brand teas, and that's sustaining. So you come up with, I don't know, flavor of sea buckthorn Lipton tea, and that is sustaining, innovation.
Mm-hmm.
So you basically you come up with a little better product in order to keep the existing market share, because the other competitor is coming up with different type of tea, so you might lose your market share, or you even expand the market share. And then efficiency innovation is basically, it's very actually applicable to a lot of industries, including resource extractive industries like mining. So within limited resources you have, how do we squeeze to maximize your profit? That's efficiency market innovation. And thirdly, the most important, in my opinion, innovation type is market creating innovation. And it's the term coined by Clay Christensen and Ifoso Jomo, who's a friend of mine, who's a classmate at Harvard Business School. That innovation is basically making some changes in the process, in making products and services more accessible to non-consumers. So what that means is that it doesn't have to be new products or services you deliver. And it's making any products and services that was only applicable to very, basically small segment of the population who can actually afford to buy. And then to make that products or services, accessible and affordable to the majority of the population who used to be otherwise considered non-consumers. And that is market creating innovation. Basically, what that means is that it's creating a completely new market for products and services. And for those people, especially in our context, let's say Mongolia, an emerging market, who can finally afford and use the products and services to make their life easier. And then in bigger picture, into contextual terms, That's basically what startups are trying to do. So, especially for those, startup, entrepreneurs, and again, I want to remind to look up this concept of market creating innovation. For example, let me give like very clear example. For example, Tomio, right, founded by
which is ed tech in Mongolia.
Exactly, it's probably one of the hottest ed tech startups in Mongolia, right?
The last couple months.
Correct. Yeah. It's very new, but at the same time, what they're trying to do is actually create a market, create a new market. I say new because they are targeting historically considered non-consumers. So that means, majority of the population whom we consider non-consumers because they cannot afford to buy. So how do we enable, right? How do we enable those products and services that was so expensive, only available to those who are rich enough to afford, and make it so low priced or low cost, so that those who couldn't otherwise afford can actually have those services.
So unserviced part of the market.
Yeah, for example, say a kid in Hovdamak, right, in far western Mongolia, trying to learn Chinese, and he wants to study in China. But given the circumstances today, can he afford to buy or afford to go to Chinese course where he has to pay, I don't know, 400,000 Tugurk to afford for a 3-month Chinese course? Maybe not. Actually, a lot of us cannot, right? Especially if you look at the purchasing power of the entire population. Majority of the population, majority of the kids cannot afford. But then using technology, using innovation, right? How can you make that service so low priced? Instead of 300,000, you price it at 30,000 per 3-month course. And you can do that on your phone, regardless of where you are. And that's what Tomio is trying to do, right? So that's basically market creating innovation. And that's where basically, I think, in my opinion, every startup should be focusing on. And then if you just historically look at how businesses were formed in Mongolia in the last 30 years since we transitioned to the free market economy, a lot of products and services we have today in Ulaanbaatar are very much dedicated to, especially when there's a buzzword, VIP, right? So there are a lot of VIP services in UB, right? VIP karaoke, VIP car parking, VIP car washing, VIP of everything. So those services are being very much dedicated to those who can afford them, those who are rich enough, right, resourceful enough to afford those services. That's not really market creating innovation. And that's really targeting probably, 5% of the population, right? But like Tomio is basically trying to bring that products and services that was only available for that 5% of the population, and then make it accessible, affordable to 95% of the population. And that is market creating innovation. And that is how, the country that we look up to in terms of technological advancement, in terms of everything, like the US has really created where it is today in the last 150 years. So I want to give you an example, right? Specific example. So you earlier mentioned that I worked for Bank of America Merrill Lynch. Right. So just a little bit about me, I guess, just taking this opportunity. I did my undergrad, my bachelor's degree in the United States, Macalester College. I studied economics, but later on, after 5 years, doing having some work experience back in Mongolia. I did my master's in business administration, MBA, at Harvard Business School in general management. That's where basically, I guess, I learned a lot about innovation, mostly from, I guess, in lecture environment, right? But case study based. And then post MBA, I worked for Bank of America Merrill Lynch, which is one of the, I guess, largest banks in the world, probably one of the most recognized brands also in the world.
Mm-hmm.
And so I worked in the headquarters in New York office. And then later on, I transferred to our Sydney office to cover natural resource sector, which was much more applicable to Mongolia when I actually came back.
Closer.
Exactly. So everybody knows about Bank of America, right? Okay, such a recognized global brand. But then how, so if you look at, say, top 100 brands, most recognized brands around the world, probably 60% of them are of United States. How was United States able to create such global brands, such powerful global brands, portfolio of biggest firms around the world, right? So that's where, let me give you an example, connecting with innovation ecosystem and innovation. So Bank of America, the firm that I worked for 3 years, was founded, but with the name of Bank of Italy back in San Francisco in 1904. But historically speaking, it's not very long time ago, right? Mm-hmm. So it's about, 160 years ago. And then, but back then, banks weren't new. There were many banks, but banking services, right, loans, for example, was only available to those, rich part of the population, very small portion of the population who can actually afford to have a loan. So back then, banks were the concept only for rich people. Only rich people can go to bank and get their banking services. And then there was this guy, Amanda. He basically, and he was just a little fellow, like a peasant, right? Wasn't a rich guy. But then he said, why not to make this banking service available to the entire population? Well, what about the other people, right? What about the little fellows? They should be getting banking services so that they can actually, they can get the money to expand their businesses, right? Fix the roof of their houses by getting the banking loans, right? But back then it was sort of like unfathomable. Meaning, are you crazy? Are you trying to have banking services, which is basically VIP, to normal, ordinary people? That was insane. That was back then impossible. But then he said, why not? And that's how he created Bank of Italy back then, and then made that banking services available to wider population. And then within 40 years, by 1945, Bank of America was the biggest commercial bank in the world. So that was just one example, right? So what he came up with is, it was a new product or service. So when we talk about in like startups, also when we're trying to come up with, the next big ideas, it doesn't have to be brand new. It can be basically solving our today's problems, or actually, especially, applicable for developing world, emerging market. How can we make those, services and products that, the wider percentage of the population cannot afford? How can we make it affordable to common people? That is actually market creating. That's the innovation that startups should be focusing on. And that is the foundation, really the transformative power behind America where it is today. And then, for example,
so do you think, in your opinion now, with the way digitalization is picking up and startups are picking up, and then especially with most of the platforms that, for example, the Zoom that we're using makes telecommunication and communication a lot easier.
Yes.
And it's also the innovation that has been there, but it's different way of bringing the services closer to people who can't afford.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely.
So the way the startups are working right now, the way it's changing the world right now, is that especially given Mongolia is a frontier market, it's emerging. And with the innovation that you did and covering different parts of Mongolian industries and digital process, how we're transitioning from all this stuff that you just talked about and where we are right now and what seems need to be done. And then given that also EdTech and Tomio, even though it lowers the cost per person and for buying, and also it changes the education sector.
Absolutely.
It brings, in my opinion, the urgency of entrepreneurship programs in most of education sector.
Yes.
And without that, I think people are going to have hard time bringing and training the new emerging employees and then business owners who will actually hire those people.
Yeah.
And that seems to be quite interesting to me. And then for you, we're doing a lot of innovation TV series, and I'm sure you've faced with a lot of people who are questioning why you were doing this, and probably you were getting the fundings for that TV series. And then what perspective did you accumulate from that?
Yeah. So the whole idea of creating that TV show in Nation, right? Nation is basically an abbreviation for innovative nation. Right? It's a concept sort of actually quite widely used. Is actually to enable wider population to understand what innovation is. So because there's, I think, sort of a lack of understanding of the power of innovation and how it can change economically, socially, even politically. So that was really the main point. So we had 4 episodes of the show, and then the first one was talking about social innovation, how innovation can actually help social projects, and then solving social issues. And then we talked about innovation ecosystem, because when we talk about innovation, it's really, you have to create ecosystem, because innovation itself is sort of intangible, right?
Right.
So we don't say, oh, produce innovation. No, it's actually, it comes up by itself through different processes from companies, from entrepreneurs. And then we talked about innovation and poverty and how innovation can actually lift nations out of poverty. So then in that episode, we tried to demonstrate innovation actually matters probably more for Mongolia than other countries, meaning innovation actually should matter more in emerging part of the world, including Mongolia.
And it's probably a market that most of the unicorn companies can't reach at the moment.
Correct.
Right.
But at the same time, what that means is that there's a huge potential to tap, to be tapped in emerging markets, because there are so many billions of non-consumers, right? So that means new consumers that could potentially use those products and services that are not available for them. And then in the last 4th episode, we talked about
which I missed the last one actually.
Yeah, so basically sort of combining everything.
Right. Conclusion.
So it's really just 4 pieces of show that can actually give you quite comprehensive understanding of innovation, not just for the Mongolian audience. It's also for decision makers, politicians. It's for influencers who can also understand why innovation matters for Mongolia, why it's important for us, especially when we look at the future of Mongolia. Innovation is actually probably more important than anything else, because it matters for every single industry that we are in. And then, so for Mongolian businesses, I think the next big business in Mongolia is it's probably from industry that we don't know yet. And that, how can we do that? Then that really comes through innovation and supporting that ecosystem, supporting those ecosystem players, specifically those young entrepreneurs. And I mean, again, when we talk about entrepreneurs, right, the concept itself is actually not new. So 26 years ago, that Ahmedo, who founded the Bank of America, he was an entrepreneur.
Right.
And Ford, the founder of Ford company, Henry Ford, he was an entrepreneur. But back then we didn't call them entrepreneurs. But today, I think we sort of reinventing the concept entrepreneur, and then really trying to integrate it into, I guess, in our daily lives, right? Solving the problems that we face today, and powered by high technology and digitization, digital transformation. And then, for example, entrepreneurship in education, right? Like, for example, entrepreneurship as a major, it's actually pretty new, right? And I think that's actually powered by so many, I think, the successes we have seen in technology sector, powered by so many young entrepreneurs, how they're actually changing the business, how they're disrupting the existing old oligopolies and monopolies around the world. And then wherever there are many oligopolies and monopolies, or meaning, one or two companies dominating the entire industry, that means there's a huge opportunity to be tapped. And I think that applies to Mongolia very well.
So when you talk about monopoly and oligopoly, right? I think that the biggest thing that they miss is calculating the possible cost in terms of serving the unserviced part of the market.
Yeah.
And then with the way the technology and then digital solution is providing, is that lowering the per unit cost.
I think that's the thing. Yeah.
And then that also, and then with that, I think said, there's a different channel of starting business, because just like you said, back in when Bank of America was being put together, and when Ford was being put together, there was a concept of starting a new business, but probably there wasn't a concept of failing and learning on your failure to correct your mistakes for the next.
Sure.
And then failing is actually the beginning of a new start. And then that in startup community, we always talk about lean startup movement.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So with that, everything is focused on early adopters, how we launch our product as soon as possible, not necessarily
with
starting
minimum viable product MVP.
So that is probably changing the face of the education system, and then being practical.
Yeah.
Sure. And leadership.
I think that's actually a new way of thinking, concept. How can we do more with fewer resources, with less time, right?
Which is efficiency, you said,
absolutely,
right?
Absolutely. How can we apply efficiency in terms of getting things done, right? So I think that's a challenge, not just startup, that's just a challenge for every business. Then, because every business has limited resources, and how can you maximize your profit with limited resources? And then that book by Eric Roy's Lean Startup, right? And then which is sort of considered a Bible for the processing Bible for
it's a management tool pretty much now, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I mean, that concept is basically talking, as you explained, talking about when you start a new business, startup, right? Then with very limited resources, right? Then how can you bring a new product or services to a market through the concept of minimum viable product, right? Which is basically create the smallest potential prototype and test it on the market, and then fail and learn, and then adjust accordingly, improvise, and go back, and then just keep that process until you actually come up with the most potential and then product that you can sell, right? And I think those are, for example, essentially becoming sort of educational branch on itself, right?
It is, yeah.
So
it's very practical. Yeah.
Exactly, becoming very practical, where actually you can learn, right? You can learn those concepts and then apply when you start a business, right? And then I think that's actually quite new. So Eric Wright's book is actually pretty recent, right? And then still be considered a kind of Bible.
Yeah.
It's actually a pretty new book, right? So, but I think what that tells me is that there are a lot of young people, I think probably in every single country, are interested in becoming entrepreneurs, right? With the dream of creating the next billion-dollar unicorn, and bringing the disruption to existing industries and businesses, right? I think actually that's great, right? That's great. Really, spearheaded by the success we see around the world in China and in the US or in Europe, and then personally, I absolutely encourage that, but at the same, but in more systematic way. How can we teach, for example, those concepts, right? How can we build into education program so that they can actually learn? Right?
So education programs, and having said that, the series that I was in for Innovation, we constantly touched on the issue of education system, right?
Yeah.
Because my take is that in Mongolia, we have over 95% of the population is educated. We spend a lot of money on science, right? So which tells me that in terms of investing into coders and programmers, we have a lot of potentials.
Yeah.
But the downside of that is that we need to invest more into entrepreneurship side of the education, so where they can pick up their own business and scale. And then another thing that's playing against us is, well, we're landlocked and we have very small population.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that gives us another advantage, which is that we can test a lot of things cheaply at the moment.
Sure.
We can try many of the products on different segments of the market. Then the challenges became that how we scale it up to 300, 100 million people.
Sure.
And that becomes a problem, right? So that again, it comes down to access to the foreign market, international market, and funding. But then again, it comes down to really how we train our people to have more entrepreneurial mindset.
Yeah. So I think when we talk about innovation and how can we flourish innovation in Mongolia, I think that's really the kind of.
So is that innovation or is that a way to implement innovation?
Well, I guess just in general innovation. Then, so in the second episode we talked about innovation ecosystem, right?
Right.
So according to, I think there are many concepts and people talk differently about innovation, and I think one of the concepts that I like, which was put together by by MIT professors, is the innovation ecosystem for a country, and it's a very simple model. How can you create innovation? How can you flourish innovation in a country? So it's really the connection among those five major players in this ecosystem. Firstly, it's entrepreneurs, and then the government, because government has to create kind of legal and tax-friendly sort of environment where those startups are supported, right? And then thirdly, you have to have risk capital, because startups early businesses are very high risk business, and there has to be people and funds that are willing to take that risk and invest in those people and startups. And then fourthly, and then obviously big companies. And then fifth is actually the university, because university plays actually a very important role in the ecosystem, and they produce the smart, educated people, but at the same time, those patents, right? Because in the university, I guess in most perfect sense, they have institutes, right? Institutes within the university,
Right.
and that actually invests into kind of new R&Ds and new
And incubators and
exactly
different
yes.
parts of
Exactly. So those five major players, and they have it has to be sort of like very well-oiled machine with five players. And then what happens is that as a result, innovation just flourishes like itself.
Right.
So with, from those entrepreneurs, from those small businesses and the big businesses, and that's essentially that's what we want to aim for. And then the most ideal example that everyone cites is actually Silicon Valley, right? There's a Stanford University, there's Berkeley, and there is a family of funds, right? Venture capital investors, investment funds, and willing to invest in high risk early businesses. And then government policies that support to have that ecosystem, right? And then, but what something that's not included in this ecosystem, but I think in overall picture, extremely important is actually innovative culture. And then because as a result, America was able to create an innovative culture. And that really feeds itself by creating innovations, by supporting those businesses, by supporting those entrepreneurs. And that takes time. That takes a lot of mindset change. And that's what's great about America. They have been able to create an innovative culture within their system, within their mindset. And that has been really powering the US economy in 150 years or so.
All right. It's great that you talk about culture. Now let's focus on your podcast Unlock, because that I think many people listen to it, and then you guys discuss books, right?
Yeah.
And then I think in most cases that you guys bring out what's interesting thing about the book, and then most of the books that you guys talk about is cultural change.
Yeah.
And then how that author and then what we can take from that book to change that we look at the society.
Yeah.
That we can tell more about your podcast Unlock.
Sure. So in my opinion, and then I think what's priceless about education and the nature of education is actually changing somebody's mind.
Mm-hmm.
That's actually giving a different perspective and changing somebody's perspective, changing somebody's angle to see things by 1% is actually priceless.
Right.
That's basically what we focus on through our podcast.
When did you start?
So we founded Unlock Podcast about 3 years ago. So actually not about, it's exactly 3 years ago, with an aim actually to basically exchange or share that wealth of knowledge that we acquire through reading bestseller books around the world in so many different fields. So behind Unlock Podcast, there are 3 co-founders, and then actually the other 2 co-founders, Diksha and Degi, who used to work in Tokyo, Japan, in their respective industries, really founded it. And then from the 4th episode, I joined them, and actually it's kind of funny. I joined them because I criticized. And then, so we basically joined the forces together, 3 of us. And back then I was an investment banker in Sydney, pulling together like 80, 90 hours a week, still super busy. But at the same time, this project was so meaningful that, we all decided to do it on a voluntary basis. So the idea of Unlock Podcast is, it's reading one international or bestseller book in nonfiction in English, and then talk about, basically summarize and critique and review that book within 1 hour in Mongolian language through the podcast platform for the Mongolian audience around the world. So so I think last week we recorded, I think, 90th episode. So that means we have done 90 episodes when probably we have read 86 bestseller nonfiction books in English in so many different fields: history, startup ecosystems, or entrepreneurship, management, economics, psychology, self-help, you name it. We have covered so many different, even how to raise a baby.
Right.
So we covered so many different fields, and the idea is really, we acquire all those knowledge through reading those books. Why not actually share that wealth of knowledge with those Mongolian non-consumers, who cannot afford to buy those books, or who do not have time to read those books, or simply just those books that were not available in Mongolian language.
Right, that's true.
And since we started, it's been 3 years, and we have got audience, meaning Mongolians listening, tuning into our podcast.
It's increasing in numbers too, right?
From at least 60 different countries and 21 provinces throughout Mongolia. So that means we have got a quite global audience, only Mongolian, obviously, listeners. And then what's interesting and our take on is that, and I mean, we have been very impressed with, I think, young Mongolians. They are basically looking for opportunities to absorb that wealth of knowledge, and basically looking for betterments of themselves, and which is sort of manifested itself through the success of our podcast. They could have tuned into other podcasts where they hear about, listening, all those interviews with, I don't know, many other people. But how come like Unlock podcast, which talks about kind of boring books, is has the biggest audience? It's kind of funny, but but what that tells me is that actually those young Mongolians, they're actually willing to learn, they're willing to absorb all that knowledge, and then I think that's very impressive about Mongolians. I think
the way I see is that nowadays when you get in the taxi, when you have exchange words with the taxi driver, you tend to notice what they value more is that they want to find out someone's opinion about something. And back in a few years ago, I guess maybe more than 10 years ago, people prefer to listen to FM radio and listen to music. Right now, what they want to hear is what the Mongolians are doing in different parts of the world, and what they're finding out, and how they're shared. And I remember, including the podcast, and then there's a FM radio called right? So Global Mongolians. Like many of the stories are from Mongolians living in different parts of the world. They're sharing those stories. Either it's a Facebook post, Instagram post, they're talking about it. The whole time they just talk about different experiences, and they barely play any music, right? But people are just very fond of it. And that's the great thing about society now. And people are getting caught up with this different way to explore different lives through podcasts and FM, AM radios and stuff like that, right?
Different.
So that's so having said that, I think that we are, and especially given the fact that we're a small community of country, we are changing rapidly. Like once we get something in Mongolia, people tend to observe it fast. But it takes a while for the first part of the people to start taking it, right? Once it start taking it, goes fast. And they get tired of it. Do you think that can be a phenomenon in like a frontier market?
Well, I think so. I think at least based on my experience, having lived in Europe and North America and finally Australasia, I think young Mongolians are very observant and I think very smart. And I think that's probably an area we need to tap on. That I think that's where our biggest potential lies, and not just the resource under the ground. But just like any other industry that we have observed throughout the world, even through the history of businesses around the world, and there needs to be some sort of like maverick companies. Somebody needs to lead it. Somebody needs to show and then showcase that you can actually start a business in Mongolia and then test it in Mongolian market, use the Mongolian market as a kind of testing opportunity and go global. And then we witness, some of the, Mongolian great startups doing that. And then once it's proven, once others are inspired that, actually you can do that. Even in Mongolia, I think there will be a lot of other young Mongolians who will be probably build the next of Mongolian businesses. And really, I think to me, the biggest potential of Mongolia for the future is actually in the brain of young people. And then how can you tap that? How can you create an environment in terms of policy-wise, right? In terms of mindset, in terms of education? How can you create an environment where that can thrive, that young people can thrive and start a business and go global and really creating the next big billion-dollar business in Mongolia and create values, create wealth for the nation and jobs for the people, and really take Mongolia to the next level in terms of economics, in terms of social benefits, and in terms of politics.
So that brings me to next question that I was kind of keen to ask, because now I guess your career path is changing a bit in the eyes of the public. I don't know how you see it, so that's what I want to ask, because now you spend a lot of time for the last 3 years dedicating your time to podcast, entrepreneurship, right, and business. Now you're switching to government agency, running the mining and heavy industry. So how do you see your career path is going to go from here on? And then being there in the government agency, do you think you can have a bigger influence on the things that you think need to be changed?
You ask a tough question.
Oh, yeah.
So I think in terms of my career progress, so it's not really changing, because I think a lot of people might assume that mining, why mining? Well, isn't mining new to you? But not really. But my career has been actually related to mining industry from the beginning,
right?
But mostly from corporate finance perspective. But I think that gives me actually quite an edge that I can use in the industry. So, for example, when I was at Bank of America Merrill Lynch, especially in the Sydney office, I used to cover natural resources and really understood and at least try to understand how Australia, which is considered, I think, one of the most success case stories in the backbone of its mining industry, how they have developed their mining sector, and how they've developed their country in the backbone of its mining industry with great potential, how they have avoided resource curves and other potential pitfalls. So to me, that was quite an eye-opening experience, looking at the industry and the country and the progress, but from investment banking perspective, from corporate finance perspective, by working for the one of the biggest brand names globally, not just in Australia, right? Merrill Lynch. So, and then when I came back to Mongolia, and then I think that was one of the sectors that I, obviously kept a close eye on, because of my background. How can we how can I contribute in the development of its resource sector, which is actually very important because 25% of our revenue is specifically generated from one sector, mining resource sector. And then this sector has a huge potential for this country, right? We are blessed with natural resources, but then how can we use it in a right way to basically help the Mongolia to move to the next level, right? How can we share that wealth, in an equal terms among its population? And how can we use the mining resources to fund those mega projects that actually we need to develop, go to the next level? So this is a very key sector, and then where I have background on and I have international experience in. So that's why, I wanted to be in that sector, and I'm actually, honored and feel very much privileged to be appointed as the Vice Minister of Mining and Heavy Industries, where I would love, I'm very much keen to contribute what I've learned to move this sector to the next level. And then again, so in those sectors where we have competitive advantage, should be using innovation the most. So innovation shouldn't be just in a high-tech sector or in any other sector. In emerging markets especially, we should be using innovation in the sectors that we have the best competitive advantages. And that's actually, for example, resource sector, right? Mining sector and heavy industries. How can we use innovation? How can we tap into those sectors actually, create value, create jobs, create wealth? That's why I picked it, and I'm definitely privileged to be part of it and contribute it and hopefully take it to the next level.
Yeah, I'm happy to hear that. And for those people who are viewing our program right now, and then also ones from overseas, probably thinking like, why are they having someone who is from the government, right? Mm-hmm. So I think, in my opinion, countries like Mongolia, where at least like half of the economy depends on government budget, government investment, and then one big sector, right? So in that country, the way the government makes steps changes the whole thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And then just like you said, that you hope to change and hope to bring in more innovation in technology and digital solutions into government services, which we've done so well for the last few years, right? But again, we still need other technologies like we need blockchain, right? Yeah, in that case, we can save a lot of cost. We can have uniform services around, and then we need some outsourcing, right, and stuff like that. And then to bring that in, we need, like you said, the culture. We need to change the culture. Yeah. We need to change the culture within the general public. We need to change the culture within the government organization and in the business arena as well. Yeah, so I think that's why, and then that's why we should bring more people like yourself into those places.
Exactly. Like on that point, I just want to reiterate that, especially taking this opportunity for those who might be, working, living, studying abroad. I want to say that, I think there are lots of opportunities in Mongolia where they can make a lot of differences. And then if making a difference, in somebody's lives or in some country is your priority, I think Mongolia is the place to be. So I would, taking this opportunity, I would love to, take this opportunity to invite those fantastic Mongolian, young Mongolians who are abroad working in their respective sectors or studying their fields, and come back to Mongolia and
contribute,
because it can be, honestly, it can be greater than how you might be thinking. It can be bigger than what you might be wishing. So I think there are lots of opportunities, where we can make a difference, you talked about changing culture in the government organizations, in the public sector, in the private sector. I think there are lots to do and full of opportunities where we can make a change. And then I think if we all, the more, the merrier, or the better actually we can work. So I think there are a lot of young people who are educated, who are experienced locally. And then, but on top of that, I think if there are more Mongolians who gain their experiences, education abroad, and all come together, I think we can be much powerful force, making a difference as we wish.
Yeah, it's a great place to actually end our conversation. But again, I think I'm just so happy that you said everything you said towards the end. I mean, to me, because we're just few in numbers, the only power we have is experience and an educated people coming back here and then putting together everything, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, and again, it takes everyone, right?
Yes,
so,
absolutely.
all right. Well, thank you very much for coming and sharing your opinions and experiences. And again, it's sharing your experiences to the startup community means like giving a lot, giving first, and that's the philosophy we go by. So again, I hope to see you again here and share your experiences again with the different fields and stuff. So
absolutely. And finally, thank you so much for your invitation. And then if you guys are more interested, I guess, or would like to keep in touch, or then there's my page on the Facebook where you can actually reach me. So feel free.
Batnairamdal.
Yeah, Otgonshar.
Okay. So follow him on there. So all right. Well, thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you so much.